He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid no one would remember who he had been before the world decided who he was now. The room smelled of antiseptic and cold steel, the kind of sterile quiet that pressed against your chest until breathing felt like work. And under the pale fluorescent lights, Ethan Cole sat perfectly still, wrists resting loosely, eyes not on the clock ticking down the final 30 minutes of his life, but somewhere far beyond the walls, somewhere only memory could reach. And when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't shaking, wasn't angry. It was something softer, something almost forgotten. I just want to see Rex. The guard across the room shifted, uncomfortable, as if the request carried more weight than the sentence itself, because everyone in that room knew the name even if they pretended not to, knew the stories whispered through barracks and briefings about the Marine and his dog, who had once walked through dust and fire like they were made of the same breath. But rules were rules, and time didn't bend for sentiment. Not here, not now. Yet Ethan didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply leaned back, slightly, eyes half-lidded, as if he could already feel the warmth of fur against his hands. And for a moment, the ticking clock seemed to fade beneath the memory of another place, another time, where the air had smelled like sand and diesel, and the horizon stretched wide and unforgiving under a burning sun, where Rex had first chosen him, not through command, not through training, but through something quieter, something instinctive. The way the dog had walked past 3 other handlers without hesitation and sat at Ethan's boots, looking up with those steady amber eyes that didn't ask permission, didn't seek approval, only offered presence. And from that day forward, they had moved as one, through patrols that blurred into nights and missions that ended in silence rather than celebration, where trust wasn't spoken but lived, where a single glance could mean turn, stop, wait, live. And it was Rex who had pulled Ethan back once, when the ground beneath them had shifted just enough, when something unseen had whispered danger through the air, and Ethan had trusted him without question, stepping back 1 second before everything changed. 1 second that meant the difference between a story told and a story buried. And yet none of that mattered now, at least not to the world outside this room, because somewhere along the line, a mission had gone wrong, details lost, decisions questioned, and blame had settled like dust where it didn't belong, and Ethan had carried it without resistance, not because he believed it, but because he no longer believed anything could change it. And so here he sat, counting not minutes but memories, each one quieter than the last, until the door at the far end of the hallway opened with a sound that didn't belong to routine, a soft echo of something unexpected, and somewhere miles away, in a place that smelled of concrete kennels and distant rain, a German shepherd lifted his head, ears sharpening, body going still in a way that handlers learned not to interrupt, because this wasn't training, wasn't command. It was something deeper, something that bypassed logic entirely. And Rex stood slowly, muscles coiled not in fear but in certainty, as if he had just heard a call no human voice could carry. And though no one had spoken his name, though no leash had been unclipped yet, his eyes were already searching, already remembering, already finding the path back to the man who had never truly left him. And back in the quiet room where time pressed forward without mercy, Ethan closed his eyes for just a second longer, breathing in the sterile air as if it might hold a trace of something real, something familiar. And when he exhaled, it wasn't defeat that settled over him. It was something else, something almost like peace. Because even if Rex never came, even if the door never opened again, even if the world held to its final decision, there was a part of him that refused to let go of that bond, that memory, that silent promise made in a place far from here where loyalty wasn't questioned and truth didn't need to be proven. And as the seconds continued their steady march, unnoticed by the man who no longer feared them, the faintest sound echoed down the corridor, soft, deliberate, unmistakable, the rhythm of pause against a polished floor, growing closer with each breath, each step carrying something no one in that room was prepared to face, not judgment, not anger, but recognition, the kind that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that doesn't forget. The sound did not belong to the room, and that was what made every man inside it stop breathing without realizing why, because it was not loud, not urgent, just steady, deliberate, the quiet certainty of something that knew exactly where it was going. and the closer it came, the more it seemed to pull at something buried deep beneath uniform and protocol and years of learned detachment, until even the guard nearest the door found himself turning slightly, his hand pausing mid-motion as if his body had remembered something his mind had long forgotten. And then the door opened not with force but with hesitation, as though whatever stood beyond it carried a weight no hinge had been built to hold, and Rex stepped through, unchained, unhurried, his coat catching the sterile light in muted shades of sable and shadow, his ears forward, his gaze fixed not on the men in the room, not on the unfamiliar walls, but on the one presence that mattered, and for a moment that stretched longer than time should allow. He did not move. He simply stood there, breathing, listening, searching for confirmation not from sight, but from something deeper, something carried in scent and memory and the quiet language of bond that no distance could erase. And Ethan felt it before he saw it. The shift in the air, the change in silence, the way the room itself seemed to lean toward the doorway, and when his eyes opened, they did not widen in shock or disbelief, they softened, as though a missing piece had finally returned to its place without announcement. And he did not speak, because he did not need to, because some reunions are not built on words but on recognition. And Rex took one step forward, then another, slow, measured, as if each movement carried meaning, as if he were crossing not a room but the distance of every day they had been apart. And still he did not run, did not break into the uncontrolled joy everyone expected, because this was not that kind of moment. This was something heavier, something layered with time and truth and questions that had never been answered. And when he reached the center of the room, he stopped again, head tilting slightly, nostrils flaring as he drew in the air, sorting through it, separating the familiar from the foreign, the past from the present. And Ethan watched him with a stillness that matched the dog's own, his hands resting open, not reaching, not calling, simply waiting, offering the same trust he had given years ago on a different ground under a different sky. And then Rex moved again, closing the final steps between them until he stood just inches away, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his breath, and for a heartbeat that seemed to suspend everything, the world narrowed to that single space, that shared presence, and Rex lowered his head slightly, pressing it into Ethan's chest with a quiet firmness that spoke more clearly than any reunion ever could. And Ethan exhaled a breath he had been holding for far longer than 30 minutes, his hand rising slowly to rest against the thick fur, fingers threading gently, as if confirming that this was real, that this was not memory playing tricks in a place where reality had already begun to blur. And there was no rush in the contact, no urgency, only a steady, grounding connection that settled into the room like something sacred, something beyond the reach of rules and time and judgment. And yet, even as the moment held, something beneath it shifted, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The way Rex's body remained alert despite the closeness, the way his ears flicked once toward the far side of the room, the way his breathing changed just enough to signal that this was not the end of the story, not yet. And Ethan felt it too, not through sight, but through the familiar tension in the dog's posture, the silent warning that had once kept him alive in places where hesitation cost everything. And without breaking contact, without pulling away, Rex lifted his head slightly, his gaze moving past Ethan, scanning, focusing, locking onto something unseen by the others. And the air tightened again, the quiet shifting from peace to something edged with recognition. And one of the officials cleared his throat softly, uncertain, as if unsure whether to interrupt or simply observe what he did not understand. But before any word could form, Rex took a step back, not retreating but repositioning, his body angling just enough to place himself between Ethan and the rest of the room, a movement so natural, so instinctive, that it carried the weight of years of training and something more, something that could not be taught. And his eyes did not leave that point across the room, the focus unwavering, the intensity building in a way that those who had never worked beside a dog like him would not recognize until it was too late. But Ethan recognized it immediately, the same look Rex had given just seconds before danger revealed itself long ago, the same stillness before action. And his voice, when it came, was quiet but certain, not a command, not a plea, just a truth spoken into the space between them. "You smell it, do not you?" and Rex did not respond with a bark or a movement. He simply held that gaze, that unwavering certainty, and in that moment, the room changed again, because what had entered was no longer just a reunion. It was a question waiting to be answered, a truth waiting to be seen, and no one inside those walls was ready for what that answer might reveal. No one moved, not because they were ordered to stay still, but because something older than command had taken hold of the room, something instinctive that told them interruption would only make things worse. And Rex remained exactly where he stood, his body aligned with Ethan's, his focus locked across the space as if time itself had narrowed into a single point. And for a few seconds, nothing happened, nothing visible at least. But beneath that stillness something was unfolding, something quiet and precise. The kind of recognition that does not rely on sight or sound but on memory carried through scent. And Rex inhaled again, deeper this time, drawing in layers of air that no human in the room could separate, sorting through traces left behind by shoes, fabric, breath, and fear, until one thread rose above the rest, familiar in a way that did not belong here, not in this place, not in this moment. And his ears shifted slightly, a small adjustment that went unnoticed by most but not by Ethan, who felt the change the way he always had, through the subtle tightening of muscle, through the shift in weight that signaled a decision forming before action followed. And Ethan's eyes lifted, not to the officials, not to the guards, but to the man standing near the far wall, the one who had said the least since entering the room, a man whose posture was too controlled, whose stillness felt practiced rather than natural. And for a brief moment, their eyes met, and something flickered there, something quick and almost invisible, like a memory trying to hide behind certainty. And Rex stepped forward, not rushing, not lunging, just moving with deliberate purpose, each step closing the space between himself and that man until the room seemed to shrink around them. And a guard shifted uneasily, taking a half-step forward before stopping himself, unsure whether to intervene or wait, because this was no longer a standard procedure, no longer something covered in training manuals or protocol sheets. This was something else entirely, something unfolding in real time without permission. And Rex stopped just short of the man, his head lifting slightly as he drew in the scent once more, confirming, aligning memory with presence. And then he sat, not in submission but in declaration, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering, a silent signal that those who understood would recognize immediately. And Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a truth long buried finally begins to surface. And his voice, when it came, was steady, not accusing, not pleading, just certain. "You were there." And the words did not echo loudly, but they landed with a weight that shifted the air in the room. And the man near the wall did not respond at first, his expression remaining neutral, controlled, but his hand, just for a fraction of a second, tightened against his side, a small betrayal of the composure he tried to maintain. And Rex did not move, did not bark. He simply held his position, the stillness now charged with meaning, because this was how he had always worked, not through chaos but through clarity, not through noise but through certainty. And Ethan's mind moved back, not in confusion but in alignment, connecting pieces that had never quite fit until now. The mission report that had felt incomplete, the testimony that had carried too many gaps, the moment that had been described one way but remembered another. And suddenly the silence of Rex, all those months ago, made sense, because the dog had not forgotten, had not moved on, had simply waited for the moment when truth and presence would exist in the same space again. And that moment was now. And one of the officials cleared his throat, louder this time, stepping forward with an uncertainty that bordered on hesitation. "This is not relevant to the procedure," he said, though even he did not sound convinced. And Ethan's eyes did not leave the man across the room. "It is the only thing that has ever been relevant," he replied quietly. And Rex shifted his weight slightly, not breaking position, just reinforcing it, his presence a line drawn across the floor that no one seemed willing to cross. And the room held its breath again, waiting, not for an order, not for a signal, but for something human, something honest. And the man near the wall exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to reveal the strain beneath his control. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but lacking the certainty it had carried before. Dogs respond to cues, to patterns. It does not mean what you think it means. And Ethan almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because he had heard that tone before, the one people use when they hope doubt will replace truth. And he shook his head slightly. No, he said, his hand resting once more against Rex's fur, grounding himself in something real. He responds to what he remembers, and Rex did not react to the words, did not need to, because the truth was already there, sitting in the middle of the room, undeniable to anyone willing to see it. And for the first time since the countdown had begun, the clock on the wall no longer felt like the most important thing in the room, because something else had taken its place, something that did not measure time in minutes or seconds but in moments of clarity. And as the silence stretched, no longer empty but full, the outcome that had seemed inevitable just minutes ago began to shift, not through force, not through argument, but through the quiet persistence of a bond that had never been broken, only delayed, waiting for the moment when it could finally speak without a single word. The air did not move, yet everything inside it had changed, and the silence that followed was no longer passive but alive, carrying weight, pressing gently against every person in the room until even the smallest breath felt deliberate, and the official nearest the wall adjusted his stance, not out of authority but out of uncertainty, because something had shifted beyond procedure, beyond certainty, and into a place where instinct began to outweigh protocol. And Rex remained seated, unwavering, his posture not aggressive, not defensive, but absolute, as if the line he had drawn could not be crossed by doubt alone. And Ethan felt it settle deeper into his chest, that quiet confirmation he had been searching for, not in hope, but in truth. And for the first time since the sentence had been spoken months ago, something inside him loosened, not relief, not yet, but the absence of weight that had never belonged to him in the first place. And the man across the room shifted again, a fraction of movement that did not escape notice this time, his shoulders tightening before easing, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door, as if calculating distance, time, options, and that hesitation spoke louder than any denial ever could. And one of the guards, older than the rest, his face marked by years of watching moments exactly like this unfold in different forms, stepped forward just enough to break the stillness without shattering it, his voice low, careful. Sir, we may need to pause. And the word pause did not belong in that room, not on that day, not at that hour. Yet once spoken, it lingered, refusing to disappear, and the official who had spoken earlier opened his mouth to respond, to restore order, to bring the moment back under control. But the words did not come as easily as they should have, because control had already shifted, quietly, without permission, into the hands of something that could not be commanded. And Rex's ears flicked once more, his gaze never leaving the man in front of him. And then, slowly, deliberately, he stood, not rushing, not lunging, simply rising with purpose, stepping forward one pace, then another, closing the gap just enough to make avoidance impossible. And still he did not bark, did not growl, because this was not about noise, this was about clarity. And he lowered his head slightly, drawing in one more breath, deeper than before, as if sealing the memory into the present. And the man's composure faltered just enough to be seen, a tightening of the jaw, a shift in footing, a glance that lingered too long toward the exit. And Ethan watched it all with a calm that did not come from acceptance but from understanding, the kind that arrives when scattered pieces finally fall into place without force. And his voice carried across the room again, steady, grounded. You remember the ridge, he said, not as a question but as a statement. And the man did not answer, but silence, in that moment, was louder than denial. And Ethan continued, not raising his voice, not pressing, simply laying truth where it could not be ignored. You were the one who changed the coordinates. And a flicker of something crossed the man's face, quick, almost invisible, but enough for those who were watching closely, enough for the guard beside him to take a subtle step closer, not in aggression but in awareness. And Rex remained where he stood, no longer seated, no longer still, but present in a way that anchored the moment, his body angled slightly, his stance balanced, ready not to attack, but to hold, to keep the truth from slipping away again. And the official who had tried to maintain order finally spoke, his voice thinner now, less certain. "This is not admissible. This is not evidence." But even as he said it, his eyes moved between the man and the dog, as if searching for something he could not quite define, and Ethan shook his head slightly, a faint, tired motion. "It is memory," he said, "and memory does not lie the way reports do." And the words settled into the space with a quiet finality, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, and for a long moment, no one spoke, because speaking would have required choosing a side, and no one was ready to do that yet. Not when the ground beneath them had begun to shift in ways they did not fully understand. And then, almost imperceptibly, the man exhaled, a slow release that carried more than breath, his shoulders lowering just enough to reveal the strain he had been holding, and his eyes, when they lifted again, no longer carried the same certainty. And that was when the room changed again, not through movement, but through recognition, because truth, once seen, cannot be unseen, and Rex stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but easing the pressure just enough to allow what needed to happen next, and Ethan felt it, that shift from confrontation to revelation, from tension to something quieter, something that did not demand but invited, and the ticking clock on the wall, once loud, once relentless, now faded into the background, no longer the center of attention, because time itself had paused, held in place by a moment that refused to be rushed, and somewhere beyond the walls, the world continued as it always had, unaware that inside this room, something had just begun to change, not through force, not through argument, but through the quiet, unshakable loyalty of a dog who had remembered what everyone else had tried to forget, and in that remembrance, had given a man back the truth he never lost, only buried beneath the weight of a story that was never his to carry. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like something fragile being handled with care, and for the first time since the room had filled with quiet certainty, a different kind of sound emerged, not loud, not disruptive, but human, the faint shift of breath, the subtle repositioning of feet, the quiet acknowledgement that what had just happened could not simply be ignored and filed away, and the older guard who had spoken before took another step forward, his voice lower now, steadier. "We need to stop this process." And this time no one corrected him, no one rushed to restore order, because the word process no longer carried the authority it once had, and the official nearest the door hesitated, his eyes moving from the clock to Ethan, then to Rex, and finally to the man whose composure had begun to fracture in small, undeniable ways. And that hesitation, that single moment of uncertainty, was enough, because it allowed truth to take one step further into the light, and Ethan remained seated, his posture unchanged, but something in him had shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way a man straightens when a weight is finally lifted from his shoulders, and his hand rested again against Rex, not gripping, not clinging, simply present, the way it had always been when words were unnecessary. And Rex stood beside him, no longer fixed on confrontation, but still alert, still aware, his presence a constant reminder that what had been revealed could not be undone. And across the room, the man finally moved, not toward the door, not toward escape, but inward, a slight collapse of posture, a release of the rigid control he had held for too long. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of certainty. "It was not supposed to happen that way," he said, and the words did not echo with defense or denial. They settled instead with something closer to truth, something imperfect and incomplete but real enough to be felt, and no one interrupted him, not because they were told to remain silent, but because they understood, instinctively, that this moment required listening more than anything else, and Ethan did not respond immediately. He did not press, did not accuse, because this was no longer about proving something. It was about allowing it to exist, fully, without resistance, and the man continued, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting. Again, the coordinates were adjusted, just slightly. It was meant to redirect, to avoid a larger threat, but it went wrong, and his voice faltered, not from fear but from memory, from the weight of a decision that had lived quietly beneath the surface for too long. And Rex shifted beside Ethan, not reacting to the words but to the tone, the subtle change in rhythm that signaled something genuine, and Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, not yet, but in acknowledgement, because he had always known something had been off, something had never aligned. But knowing without proof is a lonely place. And now, finally, that loneliness had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier, something grounded in truth rather than doubt. And when he opened his eyes again, they were calm, not hardened, not bitter, just clear. "You let them write it differently," he said. And the man nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, but enough to confirm what had been left unsaid, and the room absorbed it, slowly, the way a place absorbs something it was never meant to hold. And the official who had resisted earlier stepped back slightly, his authority no longer pressing forward but receding, making space for something that could not be managed or contained. And the clock continued to tick, but it no longer dictated the moment. It no longer controlled what came next, because time had already shifted, already bent around something greater than itself. And Rex eased down onto the floor beside Ethan, his body relaxing just enough to signal that the tension had passed. But his presence remained strong, steady, unwavering, and Ethan's hand followed him, resting again against the familiar warmth, grounding him in something that had never failed him, never turned away, never rewritten the truth. And for a long moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to force, nothing left to prove, only something to accept, something to carry forward. And finally, the older guard spoke again, his voice firm now, not uncertain. "We are suspending the execution." And the words did not ring out like a command. They settled instead like a decision that had already been made long before it was spoken. And the room exhaled as one, a quiet release of something held too tightly for too long. And Ethan did not react immediately, did not celebrate, did not question. He simply sat there, breathing, his hand resting against Rex, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his palm. And for the first time in a very long while, the future did not feel like something already decided. It felt open, uncertain, but real. And Rex lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Ethan's. And in that look there was no triumph, no relief, only recognition. The same quiet understanding that had always existed between them, unchanged by time, untouched by doubt. And in that moment, without a single word, everything that had been lost began, slowly, to return. The room did not return to normal, because what had just happened did not belong to anything normal. And even as the official stepped aside to make the call that would halt everything that had been set in motion, there remained a quiet weight in the air, something that did not lift simply because a decision had been spoken. And Ethan sat there still, not out of restraint, but because movement felt unnecessary, as if the world around him had shifted while he remained in place. And Rex stayed close, his body resting but his presence alert, the steady rise and fall of his breathing grounding the moment in something real, something that could not be rewritten or dismissed. And for the first time in what felt like years, Ethan allowed himself to look around the room not as a place of endings, but as a place where something had just begun. And the men who stood there, some in uniform, some in pressed shirts and polished shoes, no longer looked like fixed pieces of a system. They looked uncertain, human, aware that they had just witnessed something they could not fully explain. And the older guard stepped closer, his posture softer now, less rigid. "You are going to be moved back to holding," he said, his voice carrying a tone that had not been there before, something closer to respect than routine. And Ethan nodded once, not in submission but in acknowledgement, because for now, that was enough. And as he slowly rose to his feet, the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of fear but out of awareness, as if everyone understood that this moment, simple as it appeared, marked a turning point none of them would forget. And Rex stood with him instantly, not needing a command, not waiting for permission, simply aligning himself at Ethan's side the way he always had. And for a brief second, their silhouettes mirrored something older than the walls around them, something carried from distant ground where survival had depended on trust rather than judgment. And as they began to move toward the door, the man who had spoken earlier remained where he stood, his gaze lowered, his posture no longer guarded but heavy, as if the truth he had carried alone for so long had finally found its way into the open. And Ethan paused just once, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge him without words. And in that brief glance there was no anger, no accusation, only a quiet recognition of what had been and what could no longer be undone. And then he continued forward, the door opening ahead of him not as a barrier, but as a passage. And the hallway beyond felt different, the air less confined, the light less harsh, even though nothing physical had changed, because perception, once altered, reshapes everything around it. And the sound of footsteps echoed softly as they walked, measured and steady, and Rex moved in perfect rhythm beside him, his presence constant, his focus shifting now from detection to something calmer, something protective in a quieter way. And as they reached the holding area, the guard gestured gently, not commanding, just indicating, and Ethan stepped inside without resistance, turning slightly as Rex followed. And for a moment, the door remained open, the boundary between what had been and what was beginning to unfold left unsealed, and the older guard lingered there, his hand resting against the frame as if considering something he had not allowed himself to consider before. And finally he spoke, not loudly, not formally, but simply. "I have seen a lot of men come through here," he said, his eyes meeting Ethan's, "but I have never seen something like that." And Ethan gave a small nod, not as acknowledgement of praise but of truth, because this was not about him, not entirely. It was about something greater, something that had refused to be silenced even when everything pointed toward an ending. And Rex sat down beside him again, his body relaxed now, his eyes soft but still aware, and Ethan reached down, his hand resting once more against the familiar warmth, fingers moving slowly through the fur, as if reacquainting himself with something he had feared was gone forever. And outside the room, the world had already begun to shift, conversations forming, decisions being questioned, reports being revisited, and somewhere in that unfolding, the truth that had been buried was beginning to find its way back into the light, not through force, not through argument, but through the quiet persistence of something that had never forgotten. And as Ethan sat there, no longer counting minutes, no longer measuring time by what he was about to lose, he realized something simple and profound, that survival is not always about escaping death. Sometimes it is about holding on to truth long enough for it to return to you. And beside him, Rex rested his head lightly against Ethan's knee, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to Ethan, it carried the weight of everything they had been through and everything that still lay ahead. And in that quiet, unspoken connection, there was no need for certainty, no need for answers yet. Only the steady presence of something that had endured beyond doubt, beyond distance, beyond the edge of what should have been the end. And in that presence, something new had begun to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet strength of a story that refused to end the way it was written. The hours that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded slowly, as if time itself had learned to tread carefully around what had just taken place. And the holding room, once a place of waiting for an end, had become something quieter, something suspended between what had been decided and what had yet to be understood. And Ethan sat with his back against the cool concrete wall, his posture relaxed but not careless, his breathing steady in a way that came not from comfort but from clarity. And Rex remained beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, his presence no longer tense, no longer searching, but grounded, as if the task he had carried across miles and memory had finally found its purpose. And outside the door, voices moved in low currents, not loud enough to make out words, but enough to signal movement, change, the slow turning of something that had been fixed for too long. And Ethan did not strain to listen, did not try to follow the details, because for the first time, he did not need to chase the truth. It had come to him, quietly, without force, and that alone was enough to steady him. And he let his head rest back against the wall, eyes half closed, not in exhaustion but in a kind of stillness he had not felt in years, the kind that comes when the noise inside finally begins to fade. And Rex shifted slightly, turning his head toward the door as footsteps approached, his ears lifting just enough to acknowledge the movement. But there was no urgency in him now, no sharp alert, only awareness. And when the door opened, it did so without the abruptness of before, the guard stepping inside with a measured pace, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but thoughtful, as if he had spent the last hour reconsidering more than just procedures. And he paused for a moment before speaking, as though choosing his words carefully. They are reviewing everything, he said, his voice quiet but clear. The reports, the coordinates, the communications from that day. And Ethan nodded once, not surprised, not hopeful in the way he might have been before, but receptive, open to whatever came next without needing to force it into a shape he could control. And the guard glanced briefly at Rex, then back at Ethan, a faint shake of his head following. I have seen trained dogs before, he added, almost to himself. But that was not training. And Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch his expression, not out of pride, but recognition. Because there were things no training could teach, things that lived. Deeper than commands, deeper than conditioning. Things that simply existed, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And the guard shifted his weight slightly, then stepped back, leaving the door open a fraction longer than necessary before closing it again. And the room returned to quiet. But it was not the same quiet as before. It carried something now, a subtle sense of movement, like a tide beginning to turn far out of sight. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze settling on Rex. And for a moment, there was nothing else, no walls, no time, no voices beyond the door. Just the steady presence of the dog who had crossed distance and uncertainty without hesitation. And Ethan reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, resting once more against the familiar warmth. And Rex responded not with movement, not with sound, but with stillness, the kind that spoke of trust fully given, fully returned. And Ethan's voice, when it came, was softer than before, almost a whisper meant only for the space between them. You did not forget, he said, and Rex's eyes lifted slightly, meeting his in a way that carried no need for explanation, because forgetting had never been part of who he was. And as the minutes passed, the light beyond the small window shifted almost imperceptibly, the pale tone of morning giving way to something warmer, something that suggested the day was continuing whether they acknowledged it or not. And inside that room, something else continued as well, something quieter, something that did not demand attention but grew steadily in its own way. And Ethan felt it in the way his shoulders no longer carried the same tension, in the way his thoughts no longer circled the same questions without answer. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to think forward, not far, not in grand plans, but simply to the next moment, the next step, the next breath. And it felt different, lighter, not because everything had been resolved, but because something had shifted enough to make resolution possible. And outside, the voices grew clearer for a moment, a door opening somewhere down the hall, footsteps moving with more purpose now. And Rex lifted his head again, not sharply, but with quiet interest. And Ethan followed the motion with his eyes, not anxious, not impatient, just present. And when the door opened once more, it was not just the guard this time, but two others, their expressions composed but not unreadable. And one of them stepped forward slightly, holding a folder that seemed heavier than its size should allow. And he looked at Ethan for a moment before speaking. We have found inconsistencies, he said, his tone measured, careful, significant ones. And the words did not strike like a sudden change. They settled instead, confirming what had already begun to unfold. And Ethan listened without interruption, his posture steady, his gaze clear. And beside him, Rex remained calm, grounded, as if the outcome of this moment was already understood in a way that did not require explanation. And as the man continued, outlining the steps that would follow, the review, the delay, the reopening of what had been closed, Ethan felt something settle fully into place. Not relief, not yet, but certainty. The kind that does not shout or demand, but simply exists, undeniable. And in that quiet certainty, he realized something that had been hidden beneath everything else, that truth does not always arrive in time to prevent what is about to happen. But when it does arrive, it changes what comes after in ways nothing else can. And as he looked down at Rex, his hand resting once more against the steady warmth at his side, he understood that some bonds are not just about staying. They are about returning, again and again, until what was lost is finally found. The words did not end the moment. They opened it wider. And as the man holding the folder finished speaking, the room seemed to shift again, not abruptly, but with a quiet expansion, like a door inside something unseen had been unlocked. And Ethan remained where he was, not rising, not reacting outwardly, because what mattered had already begun long before this confirmation arrived, and Rex stayed beside him, calm, steady, his presence no longer carrying urgency, but something deeper, something settled, as if the path he had followed had led exactly where it was meant to. And the man continued, explaining pieces that had once been fixed but were now being questioned, details that had been overlooked or dismissed now, brought back into focus. And each word carried a weight not of accusation but of reconsideration, and Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze steady, absorbing not just the information but the shift behind it, the subtle change in tone that signaled this was no longer a formality but a correction. And when the explanation paused, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not heavy, not uncertain. It was open, waiting, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. So it is not over. And the man shook his head slightly. No, he said, it is not over. And something in that exchange settled into the room with a kind of finality that did not close the story but redirected it. And Rex lifted his head just slightly, his eyes moving between the voices, not searching now but observing, as if confirming that the shift he had sensed had taken form. And Ethan let out a slow breath, one that carried neither relief nor tension, just presence, because this moment was not about endings anymore. It was about what came next. And the man stepped back slightly, glancing toward the others who had entered with him, a silent acknowledgement passing between them before he added, there will be a full review, a reopening of the case, and until that is complete, everything is on hold. And the word hold no longer carried the same meaning it had before. It was no longer a pause before an ending. It was a space where something new could emerge, and Ethan nodded once. Not because he needed confirmation, but because he understood the weight of what had just been set in motion. And the men began to step back, not in retreat, but in transition, the room slowly returning to a quieter state, though nothing about it was the same as before. And as the door closed behind them, the sound did not feel final. It felt temporary, like something that would open again soon. And Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle, letting the shift fully reach him. And beside him, Rex exhaled softly, lowering his head once more. His body relaxed in a way that had not been possible before, and Ethan looked down at him, his hand resting gently along the familiar line of his neck, fingers moving slowly, thoughtfully, as if tracing something that had never been lost. And his voice, when it came, was quiet, almost reflective. You brought it back, he said, and Rex did not move, did not respond with anything beyond presence. But that was enough. It had always been enough. And outside the room, the world continued to turn, unaware of the precise moment when something had shifted inside these walls. But that did not diminish it, did not lessen its significance, because not all change announces itself loudly. Some of it arrives quietly, carried on steady steps and unwavering loyalty. And as time moved forward, measured now not by a ticking clock, but by unfolding events, Ethan allowed himself to stand, his movements unhurried, his posture no longer weighted by what had once been inevitable. And Rex rose with him immediately, aligning at his side without instruction. And together they moved toward the small window, the light beyond it now, warmer, softer, the color of a day that had continued regardless of what had been expected to end within it. And Ethan paused there, looking out not at anything specific, just at the simple fact that there was still something beyond these walls, still something ahead. And for a moment, that was enough. And behind him, the room remained quiet, no longer a place of final moments but a place where something had turned. Something had begun again, and Rex stepped slightly closer, his shoulder brushing gently against Ethan's leg, grounding him in the present, reminding him without words that he was not alone in this space, had never truly been. And Ethan glanced down briefly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his expression, not wide, not dramatic, just real. And as the seconds passed, they did so without urgency, without the pressing weight they had carried before. And in that quiet passage of time, something else settled into place, something steady and enduring, the understanding that what had nearly been lost had not disappeared. It had waited patiently until it could be seen again, and now that it had, there was no turning back, no returning to what had been assumed, only forward. into whatever came next, and as Ethan stood there with Rex at his side, the world beyond the walls no longer felt distant or unreachable. It felt possible, not because everything had been resolved, but because the truth had finally been allowed to exist, and in that existence, it had changed everything. The light beyond the window did not rush in. It lingered, soft and steady, as if it too understood that this moment was not meant to be hurried, and Ethan stood there a little longer than necessary, not because he was searching for something outside, but because for the first time in a long while, he was not being pulled backward by memory or pushed forward by fear. He was simply standing in the present, and Rex remained close. His body angled slightly toward Ethan, not in vigilance, but in quiet companionship, the kind that does not demand attention yet never leaves, and behind them, the room held its stillness, no longer heavy, no longer final, just a space between what had been decided and what was now unfolding, and the seconds passed differently now, not sharp, not pressing, but wide, as if time itself had loosened its grip, and Ethan eventually turned away from the window, not with reluctance, but with a calm acceptance that what mattered was no longer out there, it was here, in what was beginning to take shape. And as he moved back toward the center of the room, his steps were unhurried, measured in a way that reflected something deeper than control, something closer to understanding, and Rex followed without a sound, his presence aligned, his movements effortless, as if this path had always been theirs to walk, and the door opened again, this time without pause, the same men stepping in, but their posture had shifted, their presence no longer carrying authority alone, but responsibility, and the man with the folder stepped forward once more, though now he held it differently, not as a final record, but as something unfinished, something that still had space to change, and his eyes met Ethan's, not briefly, not formally, but with a steady recognition of what had occurred. "We have contacted your former unit," he said, his voice even, deliberate. "And we are retrieving additional records, communications, anything that can clarify what happened that day." And Ethan listened, not with urgency, not with the need to grasp onto each word, but with a quiet receptiveness, because the truth no longer felt like something he had to chase. It felt like something already moving toward him, and the man continued. "There are also witnesses we had not fully considered before." And he paused, as if weighing the next words carefully, "including one who has already requested to speak." And something in that statement settled deeper into the moment, not as a surprise, but as confirmation that what had begun could not be easily contained again. And Ethan nodded once, his expression steady, not hopeful in the fragile way it had once been, but grounded, because this was no longer about hope, it was about alignment, and Rex shifted slightly beside him, his ears lifting just enough to register the change in tone, the subtle forward movement of events. And though he did not understand the words, he understood the shift, the way the air carried something new, something no longer tied to endings, and the man closed the folder gently, not with finality, but with intention. "You will remain here for now," he added, "but under different status." And the word different did not need explanation. It carried its own meaning, its own weight, and as the men stepped back once more, the room did not return to silence in the same way. It held something now, a quiet anticipation, not restless, not urgent, just present, and Ethan sat down again, not because he was told to, but because it felt right, because this was no longer a place he needed to escape. It was a place where something was unfolding, and Rex settled beside him once more, his body relaxed, his breathing slow, steady, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze unfocused for a moment as his mind moved not backward, not forward, but inward, connecting pieces, aligning memory with what had just been revealed. And for the first time, the memory of that day no longer felt incomplete. It felt like something that had been interrupted, paused, waiting for its full shape to return, and he let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just present, and his hand moved again to rest against Rex, the familiar contact grounding him, reminding him that some things had never shifted, had never been rewritten, and as the minutes continued, they did so without the weight they once carried, each one passing not as a step closer to an end, but as part of something ongoing, something still being shaped. And outside, footsteps moved again, voices carried. Faintly, doors opened and closed, the quiet machinery of a system adjusting itself. And inside, Ethan remained still, not waiting in the same way he had before, but existing within the moment, allowing it to unfold without resistance. And Rex lifted his head briefly, his eyes meeting Ethan's once more. And in that look, there was no urgency, no question, only the same steady presence that had carried them both through everything that had come before. And Ethan gave the smallest nod, not as a command, not as a signal, but as an acknowledgement of something that did not need words. And in that quiet exchange, something settled fully into place, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The understanding that what had nearly ended had instead transformed, that what had been written as final had become unfinished, and as the light beyond the window continued to shift, marking the passage of a day that no longer belonged to the past, Ethan realized something simple, something clear, that sometimes the truth does not arrive in time to stop what is coming. But when it does arrive, it changes everything that follows. And beside him, Rex remained, steady as ever, a quiet reminder that some bonds do not just endure. They return exactly when they are needed most. The day did not announce its passing. It shifted quietly, the light beyond the window softening into a warmer hue that stretched across the concrete floor in long, muted lines. And inside the room, Ethan remained seated, not because he had nowhere to go, but because for the first time, he did not feel the need to move ahead of what was unfolding. And Rex lay beside him, his body at ease, his breathing slow and steady, the kind of calm that only comes when purpose has been fulfilled and there is nothing left to prove. And the silence between them was not empty. It carried weight, not heavy, but grounded, like something that had settled into its rightful place. And as the hours moved forward, measured now by the shifting light rather than the ticking of a clock, Ethan found his thoughts returning to that ridge, not in fragments this time, not in broken pieces that refused to align, but in a clearer sequence, the air thick with dust, the distant hum of engines, the subtle tension that had lingered before anything had gone wrong. And he remembered Rex's posture that day, the way he had paused, not reacting, but sensing, the same stillness he had shown in the room earlier. And Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing that the warning had been there, always had been, but something had overridden it, something human, something flawed. And now that memory no longer felt like a question, it felt like an answer waiting to be fully heard. And the door opened again, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a quiet intention that mirrored everything else that had changed. And this time, the man who stepped inside was not part of the earlier group. His uniform marked differently, his posture carrying a familiarity that did not belong to this place. And when his eyes met Ethan's, there was no hesitation, only recognition. And Ethan rose slowly, not out of obligation, but because something in that presence called for it. And Rex stood instantly beside him, his body alert, not tense, but aware in a different way, as if he too recognized something carried in the air. And the man took a few steps forward, stopping at a respectful distance, his voice steady. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves," he said, and the name settled into the room with a quiet gravity. And Ethan nodded once, the connection forming immediately, because some names carry memory with them. And Reeves continued, his gaze shifting briefly to Rex before returning to Ethan. "I was there," he said, not as a declaration, but as a truth that had been waiting to be spoken. And the room seemed to draw inward slightly, focusing on that single thread that now connected past and present. And Ethan did not interrupt, did not question. He simply listened, because this was the moment everything had been leading toward. And Reeves took a slow breath, as if grounding himself before stepping fully into what needed to be said. "The coordinates were changed," he began, "but not by you." And the words did not land with shock. They settled with confirmation, aligning with everything that had already begun to surface. And Rex shifted slightly, his posture easing just enough to signal recognition, not of the words, but of the truth behind them. And Reeves continued, his voice steady, though something deeper moved beneath it. There was pressure from above, adjustments made quickly, without full verification, and when it went wrong, the reports were rewritten to simplify what happened. And he paused briefly, his eyes holding Ethan's, to contain it. And the word lingered, carrying more weight than the rest, because containment is not the same as truth. And Ethan let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just real, and he nodded once, not because he needed to accept it, but because he had always known, and now it had finally been spoken aloud. And Reeves stepped closer, not crossing any boundary, but narrowing the distance enough to make the moment more personal, more grounded. "I should have said something sooner," he added, and there was no excuse in his tone, no attempt to soften it, just honesty. And Ethan shook his head, slightly, not dismissing the words, but acknowledging them without judgment, because some things are not about blame, they are about timing, about when the truth finds its way through. And Rex sat down beside Ethan again, his presence calm, steady, as if the path had finally reached the point it was always meant to. And the room held that moment, not rushing it, not breaking it, just allowing it to exist. And as the silence settled once more, it carried something different now, something complete, not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of alignment. And Ethan looked at Reeves, his expression steady. "You came back for it," he said quietly, and Reeves gave a small nod. "Some things do not stay buried," he replied, and the words felt less like a statement and more like a truth that had been proven. Standing there in the space between them and outside the room, the world continued, unaware of the exact moment when everything had shifted, but inside, something had fully come into focus, something that could not be undone or rewritten again. And Ethan felt it settle into him, not as relief, not as victory, but as clarity, the kind that does not need to announce itself. It simply exists, undeniable. And beside him, Rex remained, steady as ever, his presence unchanged, his loyalty not defined by outcome but by truth. And as the light beyond the window continued to fade into the softer tones of late afternoon, Ethan realized something simple, something that had been hidden beneath everything else, that the truth does not always arrive when it should, but when it does not come quietly. It comes with the weight of everything that has waited for it, and in that weight, it changes not just what is known, but what is possible next. The room did not feel the same after the words were spoken, not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible had finally settled into place. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer, facing Daniel Reeves, the weight of what had been said not pressing down on him, but lifting something that had been carried too long. And Rex remained at his side, still, grounded, his presence no longer searching, no longer questioning, but simply there, as he had always been. And the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was complete, the kind that comes after something true has finally been spoken aloud. And Reeves did not rush to fill it, did not try to explain further, because he understood that some moments do not need more words, they need space. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, not out of agreement, but out of acknowledgement, because there are things that cannot be fixed, only understood. And as he lowered himself back into the chair, the movement was calm, deliberate, as if he were stepping into a new version of the same moment, one that no longer held the same weight. And Rex followed, easing down beside him, his body aligned once more, his breathing steady. And for a few seconds, nothing happened, and that nothing was important, because it allowed everything to settle, to find its place without force. And then Reeves spoke again, his voice quieter now, less formal. "They are going to reopen everything," he said. "Not just the reports, but the command decisions, the chain of communication, all of it." And Ethan listened, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a steady acceptance, because the outcome no longer defined him the way it once had. And Reeves continued, "It is going to take time." And Ethan gave a slight nod, because time no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like something that could finally work in his favor. And Rex shifted slightly, his head lifting just enough to glance at Reeves, then back to Ethan, as if confirming that the moment was still grounded, still safe. And Reeves took a step back, his posture easing, the rigid lines of duty softening into something more human. "I should have trusted what I saw that day," he added, not as an excuse, but as a truth he was willing to carry now. And Ethan looked at him, not with judgment, not with resentment, but with a quiet understanding, because he knew what it meant to hesitate, to follow orders when instinct said otherwise. And he shook his head slightly. "You are here now," he said, and the words were simple, But they held more than forgiveness. They held recognition, and Reeves nodded once. The weight in his shoulders shifting just enough to show that something inside him had changed as well. And for a moment, the three of them stood there, connected not by rank or role, but by something shared, something that had passed through time and distance and finally arrived where it needed to. And then Reeves stepped toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back once more. "He never forgot," he said, glancing briefly at Rex. And Ethan's hand moved instinctively to rest against the dog's neck, fingers pressing gently into the fur, grounding himself in that truth. And when the door closed behind Reeves, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation, and the room returned to quiet once more. But now that quiet carried something different, something steady, something that did not need to be filled. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders no longer tight, his breathing even, and he looked down at Rex, really looked this time, not through memory, not through fear of losing him again, but in the present. And Rex met his gaze without hesitation, his eyes clear, calm, holding the same unwavering presence that had always been there. And Ethan let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, though it carried no sound, just a release of something that had been held too long. And he shook his head slightly. "You waited," he said quietly, and Rex did not move, did not respond, because he did not need to. The truth of it was already there, in every moment that had led to this one. And as the light outside shifted further, moving toward evening, the room took on a softer tone, the edges less harsh, the shadows longer, and time continued to move, but it no longer felt like something slipping away. It felt like something opening, and Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, not to rest, but to feel the stillness fully, to let it settle into him. And when he opened them again, nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because the weight was gone, the question answered, the truth no longer hidden. And beside him, Rex lowered his head once more, resting it lightly against Ethan's leg. A small gesture, almost unnoticeable, but in that gesture was everything: loyalty, memory, return. And Ethan placed his hand gently over the dog's head, holding it there, not tightly, not possessively, just present. And in that quiet connection, he understood something that no report, no court, no system could ever define, that sometimes the truth does not need to be proven, it only needs to be remembered. And as the day moved toward its close, not as an ending but as a transition, Ethan remained there, no longer waiting for what would happen next, but ready for it, whatever shape it might take, because for the first time in a long time, he was not standing at the edge of something final, he was standing at the beginning of something that had been waiting to return. The evening did not arrive with darkness all at once. It settled slowly, like a quiet hand resting over the day, softening the edges of everything it touched. And inside the room, the light shifted from pale to warm to dim, stretching shadows across the floor in long, quiet lines that moved without urgency. And Ethan remained seated where he was, his back no longer pressed rigid against the wall, but resting with ease, his posture carrying a kind of stillness that did not come from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something settled. And Rex lay beside him, his body relaxed fully now, his breathing slow and even, the rise and fall of his chest steady like a rhythm that had never changed. And for a long while, neither of them moved, not because they were waiting, but because there was nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove, only something to be held, something that had finally found its way back. And the quiet inside the room was no longer empty. It carried presence, the kind that does not ask for attention but fills the space completely. And Ethan's thoughts drifted again, not in the fractured way they once had, but in a clear line, moving through memory without resistance. And he saw it again, the ridge, the dust, the silence before everything shifted. But this time it did not end in confusion. It did not stop at the moment things went wrong. It continued, unfolding with the clarity that had been missing before. And he saw Rex in that moment, not reacting, not panicking, but holding still, sensing something deeper, something misaligned. And Ethan realized now that the truth had always been there, not hidden, just overlooked, because sometimes what is quiet is mistaken for what is insignificant, and yet it is often the quietest things that carry the most truth. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded. and when he looked down at Rex, there was no distance between what had been and what was now. Only continuity, only the same bond that had endured through everything, unchanged by time or circumstance. And his hand moved again, resting gently against the dog's side, feeling the warmth, the steady life beneath his fingers, and, for a moment, that was all that mattered. And then the sound of footsteps approached once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and Rex lifted his head slightly, not with alertness, but with awareness, his ears turning just enough to acknowledge the movement. And when the door opened, it did so quietly, without the sharp edge it had once carried, and the older guard stepped inside again, his expression thoughtful, his presence no longer bound by routine, and he paused for a moment before speaking, as if giving the space the respect it had earned. "They have confirmed it," he said, his voice low but clear. "The changes to the coordinates came from outside your chain of command." And the words did not strike like a revelation. They settled like a final piece falling into place, completing something that had already been understood. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, not out of surprise, but because the truth had now moved beyond question, beyond doubt, into something solid, something undeniable. And the guard stepped a little closer, his tone shifting slightly, carrying something more personal. "They are going to clear your record," he added, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold that sentence, letting it settle fully, and Ethan did not react immediately, did not stand, did not speak, because some moments are not meant to be rushed, they are meant to be felt, and he let it move through him, not as relief, not as victory, but as alignment, as something finally returning to where it had always belonged. And Rex shifted beside him, his body easing even further, as if sensing the change not through words, but through the absence of tension, through the quiet release that had settled into Ethan's posture. And Ethan finally looked up, his eyes meeting the guards, and there was no need for a long response, no need for explanation. He simply nodded again, and that was enough. Because some acknowledgments do not require language, and the guard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, before stepping back toward the door, leaving it open just a little longer than necessary, as if to allow the moment to breathe. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and the room returned to stillness once more. But now that stillness carried something complete, something whole, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxed fully now, his breathing even, and he looked down at Rex, really looked, taking in every detail, the way the light caught in his fur, the steady calm in his eyes, the quiet strength in his presence. And he let out a soft breath, not heavy, not strained, just real. And his voice, when it came, was quiet, almost a whisper. "We are still here," he said, and Rex did not move, did not respond with anything more than presence. But that was enough. It had always been enough. And as the last light of the day began to fade beyond the window, giving way to the soft approach of night, Ethan realized something simple, something clear, that survival is not always about escaping what was meant to happen. Sometimes it is about holding on to what is true long enough for it to return. And beside him, Rex rested his head gently against Ethan's leg once more, a small, quiet gesture. But in that gesture was everything: loyalty that had not wavered, memory that had not faded, and a bond that had carried them both through to this moment. And in that quiet connection, there was no need for anything else, because everything that mattered had already found its way back. The night settled in fully, not with darkness that overwhelmed, but with a quiet stillness that wrapped itself around the room, softening every edge, and the faint glow from the corridor slipped through the narrow window, casting a muted line across the floor that no longer felt like a boundary. And Ethan remained where he was, not out of habit, but because for the first time, staying did not feel like being held. It felt like being allowed to exist without pressure, without the weight of something waiting to take everything away. And Rex stayed close, his head resting against Ethan's leg, the warmth steady, constant, the kind of presence that does not ask questions or demand answers. It simply remains. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, not because there was nothing left to do, but because this moment, simple as it was, held everything they had fought through, everything they had carried, and everything that had nearly been lost. And Ethan looked down at Rex again, his hand moving slowly, fingers brushing through the familiar fur with a quiet care. And he realized something that had never fully settled until now. That loyalty is not measured in moments of action. It is measured in the moments where nothing changes, where nothing breaks, where something simply stays, no matter how much time or distance tries to pull it away. And Rex did not shift, did not react beyond the subtle rise and fall of his breathing, because for him, this was not a moment of significance. It was simply where he was meant to be, and that simplicity carried more weight than anything else. And outside the room, the world had already begun to move forward, paperwork being rewritten, calls being made, decisions shifting in quiet offices where voices lowered when the truth began to surface, and none of it needed to be seen from here. None of it needed to be heard, because what mattered had already taken place in the space between a man and a dog who had never stopped recognizing each other. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady, and he allowed himself to close his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, not to rest, but to feel the absence of something that had once been constant, the absence of doubt, of weight, of a story that had never truly belonged to him. And when he opened his eyes again, nothing around him had changed, the same walls, the same dim light, the same quiet, and yet everything was different, because the meaning of this place had shifted. It was no longer where something ended, it was where something had been returned. And Rex lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Ethan's once more, and in that look there was no question, no hesitation, only the same unwavering presence that had carried them both through every moment that had come before. And Ethan gave a small nod, not as a command, not as a signal, but as an acknowledgement of something deeper, something that did not need to be spoken. And as the silence settled once more, it carried a kind of peace that did not erase what had happened, but placed it where it belonged, no longer pressing forward, no longer defining what came next. And time continued to move, but it no longer felt like something slipping away. It felt like something opening, something that would carry them forward into whatever came next, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but honestly. And that was enough. And Ethan's hand rested again against Rex, holding there for a moment longer than before, as if marking the presence, as if grounding himself in something that had never changed. And in that quiet connection, he understood something that had